Does this work? The clicker? That's yeah, it does. So I'm gonna be okay. So thank you for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to the comments from the policy panel, because this is all the other is a place where there's been a lot of research. There is a lot of thinking on the academic community, but it's very useful to have feedback. So my presentation will actually reconnect a lot to Anne's presentation at the beginning and with Erin's. And the first thing that I asked myself when I was sitting down to write this report and thinking about this is, why do we need to talk about poverty and immigration? What makes immigrant different, or how does immigration intersect with poverty? Are immigrants particularly poor? Are immigrants a particularly type of poor? Do we need to know something about immigrants that help us in the policy that we structure? So I am going to show you a couple of pictures at the beginning. And the way in which I'm going to cut the data, given that, as Erin said, in the data is a little hard to figure out who's undocumented and who's not documented, I'm going to show you people with relatively low education, which is a group in which immigrants are a lot. There are a lot of immigrants, and relatively young. And one reason why immigration and poverty are talked about together is that this group of high school people with no high school diploma and young is a group at very high risk of poverty, and there are a lot of immigrants in this group. In fact, immigrants are 25% of this demographic group, while they're only 13% of the population. So, to begin with, they are an at-risk group, or a group of them is at risk. To be honest, there are a lot of immigrants at very high level of education. Immigration distribution is bimodal. There are a lot of college educated, a lot of PhDs. And so immigration in the United States on average is pretty balanced. But the group I will talk about today is this. And if you actually drill down, of course there are some differences, but the group that overwhelmingly constitutes this 25%, 4/5 of those 25% are really Mexican and Central American immigrants. So I will show some statistics for this group relative to the native, and this is the group where undocumented presence is larger, where low skill is larger, percentage is larger. So that's a good group to consider. So first, let me show you a couple of statistics on poverty of immigrants that make you that put in perspective what kind of poor immigrants are. So if you take just the percentage of people in poverty and you take native, this is a number which has been quoted a lot today, about 14% of the natives are under the poverty line. And if you just take the Mexican and Central American immigrants overall, around 26% of them. So there are many more poor in this group, which is the largest group of immigrants, than among natives. But then if you zoom in the group at risk, so if you look at people who have only a high school degree, so relatively low level of school, and here I'm actually putting all of them, then if you look at this specific group, more or less the percentage of poor people among Mexican and Central American and native is comparable. And this group is a group that has a percentage of poor people, about 34%, much larger than the total population. So immigrants, in this sense, if you compare them with a similar native, look relatively similar in their poverty rate, but I'm going to argue they are a very different type of poor individual. And in order to do this, I'm going to give you a couple of statistics, but essentially I'm going to keep coming back to these ideas that immigrants are the prototypical working poor. A much larger percentage of people who have low education and are immigrants is employed relative to people with similar education and who are native, and a much larger share of their income comes from wage rather than coming from a lot of these assistance programs, TAMP, SNAP, SSI, and others. So in particular, even if you control for all other demographic characteristics, where they live, what is the economy in the state they are, immigrants have a 15% higher employment rate than native. Again, here we're comparing no people with no high school degree. And the share of income that immigrants derive from wage rather than from other sources is also significantly larger than native, 13%. So the image of immigrant, of poor immigrant we have really is the image of people working in agriculture, in construction, in manufacturing. This is a very large chunk of those. And in fact, this number, and the pure statistics are stunning. Then if you control for some characteristics, this is a little less. But if you just take the percentage of people who have no high school degree who are employed in the reference week in a year, 70% of Mexican and Central American immigrants with no high school degree are employed. This is an employment rate that in the US you only observe for college educated. See, is a level of employment rate which is massively large, while for native about 34% of them in the average week are employed. And similar things in terms of what is the share of income that comes from wages. For immigrants at low level of education, the overwhelming large part of their income comes from wages, 70%, while for native only 35% of their income come from native. There are other sources of income, but mostly people at this low level of education essentially either get income from wage or get income from the safety net, from income or income equivalent value of their transfers. So the first point, which I think is interesting when we talk about poverty, is we go very much back to a lot of things that Anne said. This is the prototypical working poor population in the United States. And of course, they're going to respond and a lot to what are the labor market, what is the situation. So why is it important to think that immigrants, a lot of immigrants undocumented, are working poor when we think about the policies? Well, because some of the economic events of the United States are going to affect them much more than they affect the non-immigrant at low level of skill. So they depend on labor income. So for instance, there is a lot of research that shows that the income of immigrants is much more, is fluctuating much more with the recession, and in particular the deep recession of 2007 to 2009 had a deep negative impact on a lot of immigrant families, much more than it had on the United States. However, though, and this I think is the interesting thing to learn something, however, there is also a level of resilience in the immigrant family that comes from the fact that they do depend on work, which, for instance, implies that they move geographically much more in response to local slump and local boom. So there are several recent papers that show that the response, the mobility response, state to state or city to city of low-skilled immigrants is almost as large as the mobility of college-educated US-born that move across different cities to look for or to take advantage of the opportunity and move away from economies which are slowing down. Of course, the long slump of the wages in the US, especially in the mid and low part of the income distribution that has hurt the American worker, has hurt even more the immigrant worker because, again, they have participated much less, as I will show in a second, to those supplemental income forms, so their dependence on wages make them important. So when I will talk about policy, I think that we should think of labor market policies as particularly affecting at the low end, that affect the low part of the wage distribution, as particularly affecting this group. There are a few other things which I think were very interesting on how these low-educated immigrant families who are poor but working seems to be somewhat different from the native. So, for instance, they live in families which are on average a little larger. The probability, actually, the probability of single-family household is a little bit larger. Actually, there is about 20% of, in 2014, 20% of single-family house in the Mexican and Central American immigrants at low level, with no high school degree, and about 15% in the native. But in particular, they have more kids, so they live in families which are relatively larger. And very interestingly, if you look at other social indicators, in spite of being a level of income which are relatively low, they have significantly lower incarceration rates at low levels. So this working low-skilled immigrant, there is a sequence of recent papers that show that they have a 15 to 20% lower incarceration rate. And then There is a literature that looks at their health outcome, very interesting, and somewhat behavioral type of characteristic of this family. And this seems to find, this is, at this stage, at least the literature that I looked at is mainly correlation, even well-done correlation, but it's a little hard to tease out what is it really, the difference that causes this. But since that they have a significantly lower incidence of behavior like tobacco and alcohol consumption, and therefore a lower incidence of heart disease and higher life expectancy. This is the first generation. When I talk about, sorry, here I didn't specify, there was one on Chile. When I talk about immigrants, low-skilled immigrants, I mean first generation. These are people who were born in Mexico and Central America and came here. The interesting thing that it seems that some of these health advantages seems not to transfer. So the second generation does not seem not to be as now, the mirror image of the fact that these immigrants are much more in the labor market and earn more is that much less of their income come from the safety net that we have talked about. In part, so what? Well, in part, for a good chunk of them is their non-eligibility, right? Of this group that I'm talking about, of high school drop, non-high school degree from Mexico and Central America, probably about 50, the estimate are 50 to 60% are undocumented. They don't have access. However, many of their kids have access, for instance, to food, to SNAP, and to Medicaid. But what you find is a much lower participation of their kids to this program, to this safety net. Now, both from sort of more qualitative research and then from variation across the states, it seems that one big hurdle is that these immigrants understand these forms even less than the native. The complexity that was mentioned here certainly is a bigger hurdle for them. They don't speak the language very well. They don't know how to navigate this. And certainly, as Erin also mentioned, the reform, the welfare reform of 1996 started introducing this idea that if you were foreign born, even if you were legal, it was a little harder, more complicated to get access to this program. Although now they have been reinstated, in the mentality of a lot of these people, there is this problem that it's hard to get. And more recently, I would say in the 2000s and the 2010s, there has been a fear of being identified through application of this program or singled out for deportation or their kids. So there are some interesting studies that use the difference of intensity of deportation across states in the United States and look at how this affects the difference in participation. And they see that in states which are more aggressive in deporting, even the eligible kids of immigrants for Medicaid and SNAP tend to apply much less, tend to participate much less. So the reason though why there is such a lower participation in this safety net, even in the one that the immigrants are eligible for, I think is a question, I will add, is a question on which research is still quite limited. Now, the way in which immigrants are related to poverty is often also referred through another channel. I've talked about what immigrants do in the labor market. A lot of them work. And so the natural thinking, or some people think that that long stagnation of US wages that has happened in the long run maybe is also because of these immigrants. They come here, they increase the supply of the labor, and so the wages don't grow for low education. I would say that this is a topic in which economists have obsessed for a long time, and maybe the only topic on which they have done research for a very long period. And I think that we should move beyond this. But I would say that there are many reasons why we think that immigration is not an important component of this lower wage and less opportunity. Really, first of all, immigrants move in search of this opportunity. They respond to those. And there are a lot of type of jobs that they do that are not really the one that employ the big bulk of American worker either at low level, so the competition is limited, there is complementarity. So I think on this part, we have done enough research, and I think it's interesting. There are still some controversies here, but I don't think that you can say immigration is one of the leading cause of poverty, wage poverty, low wages of natives. And I think this is essentially a settled issue. An issue which is much less researched, which I think is much more relevant to the contrary, and is kind of interesting, is that, well, maybe they don't affect the local labor market, but they may affect some local public services, crowding them and creating some disadvantage for themselves and for the native as well. And I think that the most interesting part here is looking at what happens in school, in public school in particular. And there is a starting literature on this, but I think that needs to be much more. So the first thing that people have started noticing when they look at school, public school, before that, I think it has come several times here in this conference, but I think it's consensus of economists that in the first to second generation success transfer of economic success, the schooling, the fact that being able to complete school, and then I will talk about college as well, is key. So we think that which school, how much schooling, and what type of schooling do these kids of immigrants have access to is going to be crucial for their future success. Not only, but a lot of these kids end up being in schools which become very immigrant intensive. So because immigrants tend to localize, and so Los Angeles has a population which is about 45% immigrant, and some part of the Central Valley have very large percentage, they tend to find themselves in schools with a lot of other Mexican and Central American immigrants. Now, the problem is that what has been observed is that sometimes non-Hispanic whites can move out of this community, increasing further the degree of segregation. And the question is, what are going to be the consequences both on the school, on the native that stays, and on the immigrant themselves of this? This can generate segregation, so schools which are all not very diversified, and that can have some negative impact on learning and on the long run. If there are not corresponding investments, certainly there is crowding. Some of these kids maybe need some particular assistance in language, and so this can also put a disadvantage. And if native non-Hispanic move out in large part, this could generate a further deterioration of the quality of the school where these kids go. So I would say that this is a very important point. One statistic is that in California, the average Latino immigrant, Mexican or Central American immigrant is in a school where about 87% of other kids are Latino, while on average in the nation there are 40% of Latino. So there is a very large concentration in schools. So this may affect the quality of education, which in turn may be a very important term for intergenerational. So in this, I think there are these three themes that I touched, which I think are going to be very important for researchers to think seriously about and to work on. The first, start going a little bit in reverse order, where I think there is the list, is there is a lot of research on what is the impact of your teacher on school performance, of your peers on school performance, a little bit on school resources, but there is very little in this immigration literature that looks at flow of immigrants, how local school responds, how native respond, and how the first performance and then the choices do these kids tend to go less to college, go less to some particular major after high school. So this is very important. And we know a little. The second is what determines this much lower access for much lower participation of immigrants into the safety net, even for programs that they qualify to, where there is a very large variation, but they seem to be constantly participating at lower rates than native. And then I would say it's interesting, there are these interesting, resilient, and I would call them good characteristic of the poor immigrant, which is they work a lot, they have high employment rate, they tend to go where opportunities are. What are the determinants of this? Is it because immigrants are a selected group that came from another country? Is it because they have different immigration status, so they have less access to other options, and so they need to go where the few jobs available are? Are the impact of policies? Are they impact of policies, or are they impact of some characteristics of the immigrant and some selection of the immigrant? So to conclude, I'm going to put up a few policy ideas on which I think we need to learn more, and I think in order of importance are going to be likely to definitely be sort of discussions that we're going to have. And so if we learn more as a scientist on this is very important. For all that I've said, the fact that labor market access is very important, the wage is very important, I would say that the legal status of an immigrant, some references were made which has been proved probably to increase investment in human capital, to increase wages by 5 to 10%. This is going to be one very important reform that we need to find a way of doing in the next few years. There are a lot of short-term and long-term gain from this. Of course, it can be done in many different ways, but I think this will have a very interesting and important impact. I would say that the patchwork that has been done right now, because we have not found a way of doing this, possibly one of the interesting things that have been tried is this DREAM Act, now suspended and now transformed. So the DREAM Act was the possibility for people who arrived as young children and they have studied in the United States and they are either enrolled in college or in the military to get a way to legalization. Now the same group is essentially the beneficiary of the DACA, the suspended deportation order. And I think that a measure not only that gives these people the opportunity of legalizing their status, but links this to more college education, links this to the opportunity of getting some skills which are needed is very important. I didn't talk very much about but I think college education is the real way. I'm not sure. There is a lot of uncertainty, but college education is certainly one important potential channel out of poverty for some of these kids, and so linking their opportunity of going with legal status is very important. In terms of participation to the safety net, there is some research that show that immigrants in location and in places where there are older immigrant community that know how to navigate the system are more likely to apply. So maybe immigrant-based group with a native that help them enrolling, navigating the system could be a very interesting and applicable type of method. And I think that a creative way of thinking of helping the school district that allow and admit a lot or have a lot of these undocumented is crucial. For instance, I always liked the idea of linking, so this legalization is always linked to some back taxes or some fee that the undocumented have to pay. I've always liked the idea that these fees or back taxes that are paid should be redistributed at the local level in proportion to where these people who are currently undocumented are. And I think that a large part can be channeled to the school district. So these immigrant kids don't have to be a cost. They are a cost if the resources are limited, but if they correspond, because they also bring some money, they correspond to opportunity of investment at the local level for better education or at least more resources, I think is interesting, an interesting potential. So this, I just developed this theme a little bit by sort of point flashes. I look forward to the comments of the panel and to any questions. Oh, sorry, yes. So I am going to invite Kevin Johnson and Anne Neville. I did? Yeah, I did.
You did it correct.
Oh,
That's amazing.
Nice. Okay, well, lucky.
I think so. All right, I'll start first. So, good afternoon. Thank you both. Those were great presentations, and I really enjoyed reading the papers. As I read both your papers, I was really struck by a few issues. While we're all aware that the decisions about whether people can adjust their immigration status or whether more immigrants can come to the U.S. are in the hands of the federal government, as you aptly pointed to the current this week's arguments around DAPA at the Supreme Court, state governments obviously have the opportunity to make a number of policy decisions that impact positively or negatively the health, economic, and educational opportunities for immigrants, and particularly for undocumented immigrants. And that was something you really focused on in your paper, and I think in particular to the California context is really critical. You all both focused primarily on the national impacts. And I think some of the policy recommendations were particularly relevant for California, where there are about 2.8 million undocumented immigrants in the state. So Erin's paper really recommended increasing access to mainstream institutions. Giovanni's paper talked about reducing barriers to enroll in welfare programs, increasing the minimum wage, investing in schools with larger populations of low-income immigrants. As we talked about earlier today, California has just decided to increase the minimum wage. This is, I think, a really great example of a policy change that wasn't intended primarily to benefit immigrant workers, but one that obviously is going to benefit immigrants if the outcomes are as advocates for the law have suggested. So, in considering the recommendation to reduce barriers to enroll in welfare programs, I'd like to broaden that a little briefly, broaden that and talk about immigrants' participation in government benefit programs. And you both really talked about the fact that immigrants participate at a lower rate than their native-born counterparts. And you mentioned specifically in your paper that in-group social stigma, but also the concern over potential negative repercussions that can arise from participation. In California, the state has passed more than a dozen laws since 2011 that focus on undocumented immigrants. Some of these explicitly work to counteract the potential repercussions that people fear. So, for example, AB 524 provides that a threat to report someone's immigration status or suspected immigration status may induce fear sufficient to constitute extortion. Others provide clear new benefits, such as extending in-state tuition, driver's license, and health care. So when policymakers are considering these benefit extensions, it seems really critical to consider the different program constructions and additional outreach that are likely to be needed to ensure that you're going to have the rate of participation, right, that we're looking for, given that the targeted groups usually do not participate in that. And so I think from a public policy standpoint, when we're looking at the research that you all brought up, getting that into the hands of policymakers to think about that at the outset and the construction of the program, rather than a year or two later when we're wondering why there isn't the uptake rate that we were looking for. So obviously, as you brought up, California differs from a number of states, particularly around undocumented immigration. Alabama and Arizona are really good examples of states that have gone in obviously very different direction, where they've passed public policy that clearly limits benefits for undocumented immigrants. And you had mentioned that as a potential area for research, and that's something I think would be very, very helpful, not just for California, as it looks at other public policy actions it can take, but also other states. And so understanding the effects of these laws and comparing the results in different states, so that both for California but also for those states that have yet to make a clear sort of more restrictive laws or laws that provide more access to sources. And you really brought up credible data, and I think that's a huge concern. I'm at the California Research Bureau, so we provide nonpartisan research to the legislature and to the governor and other elected offices, and we get requests all the time where we're ultimately not able to really answer the request, and we're not able to provide any kind of data-driven response that could help formulate hopefully better public policy. I think one challenge is requiring too much data. There's this idea it can result in lower participation rates. I was really interested in what you said, that there's been some research that's showing that in fact people participating in the studies are not participating as a result because they're concerned about mentioning that they are undocumented. But I think when we're talking about program participation, so when we're looking at healthcare, when we're looking at driver's licenses, so what kinds of questions can we ask? What kind of data can we retain of program participants? And how do we think about that again at the outside of the outset of the program, so that the departments and agencies within the state who are administering these programs and collecting data are at the beginning able to think about what it is that's going to be needed in a 6 months, in a year, in 5 years to be able to really analyze the impact of the program. And I think the last just point I had too is I think thinking really carefully about what data is needed. Sometimes I love data, but sometimes we get a little too excited and sometimes we want everything. And that can have other impacts, either both in making it more difficult for people to sign up, in making the risk of sharing the data, or the risk if there's a data breach even more challenging than it is today. So I think really critically looking at what it is we want to do with the information we're collecting, but doing enough of it so that we can actually understand the impact of these programs, and knowing whether we're doing the kind of outreach that's necessary to reach the populations who are it's intended to benefit.
Okay, I want to thank Anne and Marianne for inviting me to participate. I'm very pleased to be here. I've given some thought to some of these issues for quite a few years, and I always look forward to reading papers like this that provide data and information that talk about issues of critical public policy importance. In this case, the way I read these two papers together is that expanding the social safety net can help integrate immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, into civil society. And it's a very important matter for government to consider, and it's a very important goal for us to want to achieve. And just to give you a very rough sort of example of our failure as a society to integrate immigrants into our society, Giovanni mentioned that 45% of LA County is immigrant. That means 45% of LA County can't vote. That means 45% of LA County has no say in the government, how it operates. And in some ways, you should say to yourself, are you surprised that there's a good chunk, maybe a near majority of LA County that doesn't feel served by government? And it's a very, very basic thing, but it's something, we have to, as a society, think a lot more how to integrate people who are residents of our society, who go to our churches, who are parts of our community, who attend our schools. How are we going to integrate them into society? One of the problems, it's a significant problem, is at the federal level. It was mentioned by Aaron in 1996, and also mentioned by Giovanni. In 1996, there was immigration reform and welfare reform that was signed into law by President Clinton. It was some of the most punitive and unrealistic immigration laws passed last century, and they were very tough on together these two laws were very tough on two groups of immigrants. One of them are immigrants who were perceived as over-consuming public benefits. And the welfare reform was designed to reduce benefit received by immigrants, and even though some of those benefits were restored for legal immigrants, for the most part, undocumented immigrants aren't eligible for the vast array of services available, services and benefit under the social safety net. And the reason that undocumented immigrants and immigrants generally were cut off from the social safety net was the perception that they overconsume public benefits. And that's just not supported by the data that we've heard about. But that's the perception. And there's some, you can watch Republican presidential candidate debate, you can hear more about that, but it doesn't seem to be based in the data. The other sort of devil that immigration reform in 1996 sought to address was immigrants convicted of crimes, and very tough on what Congress referred to as criminal aliens. and very broadly expanded the scope of removal for any immigrant convicted of a crime. And among the most unpopular immigrants in the political process are those who have criminal problems. Now, the truth of the matter, and this is something I think came out in the presentations, is that the social science research that exists shows that immigrants, including undocumented immigrants from Mexico and lawful immigrants from Mexico, are less prone to crime than U.S. citizens. And that is very clear on that. But at the same time, you got these laws that are tough as nails on criminal aliens, and you have some Republican presidential candidates who will go unnamed in this presentation who blame particular groups of immigrants from particular countries for engaging in nothing less than a crime wave in the United States. I mean, to me, that raises, both of these questions raise a bigger question. Data is being produced, information is out there, but it doesn't seem to be always absorbed by the political process and by some politicians. But in 1996, these two very disfavored set of immigrants, public benefit recipients and also criminal aliens. Just to give you an example of a case, I can't resist this. In the Obama administration, is aggressively enforced the criminal provisions of the immigration laws. One of the cases that the Obama administration took the United States Supreme Court last year involved a guy named Muniz Maluli, who was arrested for possessing drug paraphernalia. The drug paraphernalia that he was convicted of possessing was a sock that he used to conceal some Adderall while he was in jail on a DUI charge. He was a lawful permanent resident, he's a community college professor, and he was facing removal from the United States and being torn away from family because he possessed a sock that he used to hide Adderall. Why you have Adderall in jail, I'm not so sure. Why do you want your senses heightened in jail, I'm not sure. But he was convicted of this crime, and that to me just illustrates how far we've gone in the efforts to remove criminals, immigrants. And this was a lawful permanent resident, it wasn't somebody who's undocumented. This administration has removed more non-citizens, including more lawful immigrants, than any administration in United States history. This administration has really tried to ramp up removals in ways that we've never seen them before. But I'm getting distracted. Both of the papers talk about some kind of immigration reform at a national level. Aaron Hamilton's paper talks about comprehensive immigration reform. Giovanni talks about a path to legalization for undocumented immigrants, the DREAM Act. And both of these are really designed to provide some kind of benefit, not a public benefit, not some kind of income transfer, but some kind of recognition of their status in society, giving them immigration status so that they're less easily exploited in the workplace, less easily exploited by those that they deal with economically. Studies like they provide show how by providing that kind of durability and status, you might be able to help integrate these immigrants, these members of our community into greater society. And one of the importance of papers like this, I think, is that law professors and other immigrants' rights activists often make moral arguments why we should do better by immigrants, and I very much agree with those. But these kinds of papers provide numbers and facts and other arguments that bolster some of the moral justifications for immigration reform. Now, when I think about some of the recent developments in California, and I think about the possibility of impacts on policy of studies like this, I think of the history just in the last 25 years in this state. In 1994, the voters passed by a 2-to-1 margin Proposition 187, which attempted to strip almost all public benefits, including a K-12 education, from undocumented immigrants. I remember, a lot of people here might not remember the Pete Wilson's television advertisements that started off with a sort of grainy picture along the U.S.-Mexico border saying, "They keep coming," and he was able to vindicate and to win a re-election by supporting Proposition 187. What happened after that is there was a spike in naturalizations by lawful immigrants. There's demographic changes that were taking place, and there are more Latinos across the street in the legislature now than there were in 1994, and you're seeing very different laws being passed in recent years than you saw being passed around 1994. 1994, 95, we saw laws like making undocumented immigrants ineligible for driver's licenses and things like that, stripping prenatal health care to undocumented women, even though they were going to have citizen children who'd have, if they didn't get prenatal care, might have health problems that we as a society would have to pay for. Didn't make economic sense, either of those. But things have changed in California. And what I hope for in papers like this, nationally things haven't changed quite so much yet. Still there's a debate about comprehensive immigration reform. There's a hot debate about paths to legalization, whether there should be a path to legalization. And actually it's very interesting to me as a legal matter. When people talk about amnesty for undocumented immigrants, it's a hot button issue, it's very controversial. But if people talk about parking amnesties or tax amnesties or gun amnesties, there's not that kind of emotion. Everybody says, that's a good deal. I like it. I've been the beneficiary of a parking ticket. I thought it was a great thing. But in any event, there's a real sort of, at this point, there's some very negative feelings about a path to legalization. And I think that we are going to, at some point, come to address comprehensive immigration reform. I'm not sure. When somebody asks me when we're going to pass comprehensive immigration reform and whether we're going to pass, I said, well, I think we're going to pass. I just don't know when. It could be. It's certainly not going to be within this presidency. But one of the things, and I spent a good chunk of this week focusing on the Supreme Court case, United States versus Texas, which deals with the Deferred Action Program, which is a temporary program. Arian mentioned it's a temporary program with limited relief. And a new president could get rid of that program in a minute. President Trump probably would get rid of that program very, very quickly. Actually, I think all the Republican candidates have said they would get rid of that program. What that means to me in the end is, however the court decides United States versus Texas, we're still going to be down the road considering comprehensive immigration reform, a path to legalization, some kind of DREAM Act. My hope of all hopes is that because of studies like this, and because of the facts somehow finding their way into the policy process, we can have smarter, fair, and more workable immigration policy. So I want to thank the authors of these papers for putting them together and continuing the hard work on this process. That as an educator, I find to be a very, very disturbing process sometimes, because people like these two produce this great work. And we still have some people talking like they're in the late 1800s about some of the questions. So I want to thank the authors for writing these papers.
Sure, yes. Any questions from the audience? So there are four at the same time.
Just a comment. One thing that would be helpful, I'm an advocate, would be updated information that looks at the reasons why people move from state to state. There is a piece from Steve Wallace at UCLA from 2006 that sort of disputes the idea that expanded benefits has a magnet effect, but he's told me he doesn't plan to update that, and we really need that.
So there are some recent studies on labor market mobility, sort of showing how immigrants move in response to jobs. So that seems to be the consensus, and so just published. I'm happy to send some references. And the study by Neeraj Kaushal about the magnet, how she's sort of found, I don't know if the last, but it was in the early 2010s, in which she looked at some data and shows that there is very little mobility in response to generosity, because these people don't, it's a small part of their income.
UPIC has some research on looking at effects of the more negative policies. So like Eric papers on the Arizona policies looking at migration, and do find that people tend to leave in response to those kinds of policies.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I wanted to just maybe make more of a comment or react to some of this, but worked a lot with the immigrant community and the farm workers. We did some focus groups last year that was funded by the Center for Poverty. And the farm workers did echo a lot of this, of the resilience of their with the job market looking very poor in Central Valley, of their interest in moving. And it's really things like they had talked to a lot of people because they were looking at other states, other places to go. But at the same time, even though they're resilient, they don't want to do it once they've settled with their families. And the women's side of this issue was the impact, the worry of the stress of not being able to keep the family together. So I think they can go move, and they will move, and they have to. But even the separation within the state, even if it means that the male head of the household has to move to another county, move to Fresno maybe, and while the family lives in a rural area, that kind of separation doesn't mean they have to be deportation back to Mexico. It means that the family is separated just to survive here in the United States, and that puts a huge burden on them. But at the same time, the thing that really impressed me a lot and is the expression for the community of wanting to help itself, to be able to get the resources out to help other people. So Giovanni, I really liked your ideas about bringing the economic opportunities back to assist those communities, and would add to it that using those community members to make some decisions about how to get that assistance out could really leverage those resources. It would alleviate some of the stigma that people have for social services, because they want to not only support their families but their communities, and they feel very strongly about those things. So I think that would be very important, is to really engage that community in making those decisions about how to get the services out. I think they should be decision makers, and that would do a lot to mitigate the adverse effects that might be present with climate change. Even though we're in a rainy year, it doesn't mean that it's going to stay rainy. The long-term prognosis is pretty bad for the Central Valley, I think. So, and climate change overall will affect vulnerable populations.
So if I can just a second interject, I think that this idea of bringing back some resource in the community bridges a little bit this fact that in terms of participation, sometimes these people, given that they don't have the vote, have an obstacle, but they have very strong family tie and network ties within their community. So respond at making them part of the solution for their own problem, I think, is a key thing. Even when you call for federal action, for state action, I think I am very sympathetic towards this. I think these people have the connection, the rightness to be part of their solution. They should be involved more, eventually, obviously, voting, but also before when they cannot in some other of these forms.
A very similar thought to yours, and kind of echoing what Ann and Dean Johnson mentioned, kind of focusing on what the role of the state can be. The comprehensive immigration reform horizon being very long-term, potentially. What is it that we can do as a state, and what is it that researchers can do to help us focus our attention more on the role of our state, in particular around civic engagement opportunities, aligning our policies to create more opportunities locally so that immigrants can speak up at school districts, make decisions in LA County where 45% have no voice, aligning those policies with language access opportunities, so that I think there are levers there that we can pull to help people get more interested in naturalization, literacy programs, utilizing civic institutions. I think we need to figure that out and have more research kind of open up our thinking on
that. I'll talk just not about the future research part, but about what state and local governments can do. The federal government is in charge of, and should be in charge of, the national immigration laws, deciding who to remove and who to admit. The primary role of the states, I think, and local government should be how to integrate immigrants into the community as opposed to immigration enforcement. Where I think the states go wrong is like in Arizona and Alabama, where they decide they want to in some ways take the federal law into their own hands and enforce the removal provisions of the federal law, and in simple terms, terrorize Latino communities generally, not just immigrant communities. But in terms of integration policies, and that's where I think these two papers tell us a lot, I think we should think about some very basic things. If you're interested about immigrant and immigration, and you hear people complain all the time they don't speak English, maybe you should invest and think about adult education ESL programs, which are among the most over-enrolled programs that exist. And they closed the Fremont School down in downtown Sacramento that provided ESL programs to adults. But thinking about why we didn't provide driver's licenses for 20 years to undocumented immigrants when it was a safety hazard to all of us not to have it because they didn't have liability insurance when they didn't have it. But thinking about integration and how to integrate them in society, how to get them providing health care, providing education, things like that. That's what state and local governments are better at as opposed to enforcement, I think, as a general matter.
And if I can just add, I think in thinking about what works, when state and local governments are doing grants to organizations to try out new programs, including upfront evaluation money to evaluate those programs, which is often in the negotiation process something that gets cut because it's not direct program service, and being able to integrate that upfront, particularly in newer programs that are trying out new methods, to be able to understand how replicable they really might be, I think is something key from a very pragmatic stance, but I think it can have a real impact.
Very quick on the research, I think there are a couple of things that we should learn. So I am thinking that there are a lot of states which are trying some very specific policies. The driver license, for instance, is one. It would be very interesting, and that study of PPIC that Erin mentioned started doing a little bit of this, collecting a little bit more systematically the type of laws and the type of specific state provision that different states have passed, and try to analyze a little bit more systematically what impact they had on the mobility of worker, on their access to labor market, on their opportunity of employment. And on the education and the school side, the Department of Education can give you access to very good data at the school level, and there are a lot of very interesting studies done on many questions on education. This is not been looked very much at, so maybe some of my graduate students out there can pick up some of this, but access to data on schools I think will be very, very helpful for us to work on this.
All right. I'm going to suggest we wrap up this panel and thank the panelists again. Excellent comments. We are fortunate to have, to wrap up the day briefly, you've all been troopers making it till past 4:30 on Friday. We're very grateful to have Irina Asmussen, who's the chief economist for the California Department of Finance, and she's just going to share some final thoughts and help us wrap up today.